I am the Ascended Master Maitreya. What I desire to give you in this discourse is a slightly different perspective on the situation you face on Earth, especially related to you striving to increase your Christ discernment. Now, we have given many teachings on the duality consciousness, the consciousness of separation. I have in my book about the Masterkeys to Spiritual Freedom, giving many teachings on the Garden of Eden and how these original life streams on Earth left the teacher behind. But of course, all have, in a sense, left the teacher behind. And this is what I wish to explain from a slightly different perspective. Now, if we were to say something short and concise about the duality consciousness, it would be this. When you are not in the duality consciousness, you cannot imagine what it is like to be in the duality consciousness. But when you are in the duality consciousness, you cannot imagine what it is like not to be in the duality consciousness. And there you have the essence of the problem that we face, the challenge that we face as ascended masters, seeking to help you rise out of the duality consciousness. So you may say that the story of the Garden of Eden is a symbol for this mystery school that all entered as a preparation for taking embodiment in an unascended sphere, and of course, especially on a dense planet like Earth. Avatars were not part of the original mystery school for the original life streams that were created to take embodiment on Earth, but they still entered a mystery school before they took embodiment here. The only beings on Earth that did not enter a mystery school as such were the fallen beings, because they weren't able or willing to even listen to any spiritual teacher. So they fell here. They were not prepared to gradually descend here. And so, what is it that we seek to give you when you are in the mystery school, intent on taking embodiment on Earth? Well, in the original mystery school, it was slightly different, but after the Earth fell into duality, descended into duality, we attempted to give all who embodied after that time a deeper understanding of the duality consciousness. The original inhabitants faced the initiation that I describe in such great detail in my book, where they had to experiment with the duality consciousness. But it was not at the level where they were dealing with fallen beings, despite the fact that the symbol, that the serpent can be said to be a symbol for the fallen consciousness. It is still not so that they were prepared to take embodiment on an Earth where there were fallen beings, because in the original design, in the original mystery school, there were no fallen beings on Earth. But after the fallen beings were allowed to embody here, those who descended after that time, we attempted to prepare them, and it was not just one mystery school led by me, but others, to take embodiment on a planet where there were fallen beings and where the duality consciousness was the dominant state of consciousness on the planet. Now, here's where we, from the very beginning, run into this difficulty that I just described. When you have embodied on a natural planet where you haven't encountered fallen beings and you haven't really encountered beings who were trapped in duality, you simply cannot imagine what it is like to be in duality. You have no frame of reference. And you cannot imagine what duality is like when you have not encountered it. So from the very beginning, it was quite difficult to prepare these live streams for what was the reality they would encounter on Earth. Now, what we also ran into was that most of the live streams who came here as avatars had the desire to come here and take embodiment in order to improve conditions on Earth. Most of them, most of you felt quite confident that you could do as well here as you had done on your natural planet. You could apply yourself, you could be willing to transcend yourself, and you could therefore rise above any obstacles or challenges and fulfill the task that you had defined for yourself before you decided to come into embodiment on Earth. You felt that you had designed a goal for yourself and you were confident that you could fulfill it. And as a result of this, most of you were so eager to take embodiment on Earth that you considered it an unnecessary delay to be taught all the intricacies of the duality consciousness. Most of you had the attitude that, well, I'll deal with that when I come to it. I'm sure I can rise above it. And this, of course, is a product of what I said. When you're not in duality, you cannot imagine what duality is like. So you couldn't imagine what duality was like. You thought it was no worse than what you had encountered on natural planets. It was just another challenge you could rise above. And so most of you did not spend more time than absolutely necessary in the mystery school, and you were eager to take embodiment. And of course, free will must be honored. So after we had attempted to help you see what we knew was difficult for you to see, we allowed you to take embodiment. We, of course, knew, as you also knew, that you are the conscious you, and you can rise above anything in an undescended sphere. However, what you didn't know, which we knew, was that duality makes it very difficult to rise above certain things. So you now have this situation where you descend for the first time as an avatar on Earth. Now, you do not descend into the duality consciousness, but you do descend to the 48th level. Because this is how you can help the life streams on Earth rise above their current level of consciousness by descending to the level where they began, and then showing that you can go up. You may have to descend below the 48th level before you start the upward path, but most of you could not even imagine doing this. You thought you would come down, you would be at the 48th level, and you would have a steadily upward path where you would demonstrate how to pass one initiation after the other. So what happens is that you now come into embodiment on this dense matter planet. You are trapped in the physical body. You can't get away. The fallen beings know who you are because they sense your light that they don't have themselves. And guided by their masters in the emotional, mental, or identity realm, they launch this all-out attempt to destroy you. Naturally, this is a shock to you, as it would be to anyone, even though we had tried to prepare you for it. When it actually happened, it was a shock to you. And so what did you do? Well, you reacted by going into duality. Now, we have talked about selves and separate selves. We have talked about a primal self that you created in response to your cosmic birth trauma, the trauma of taking embodiment on Earth. But you need to realize here that beyond having separate selves, and you didn't have any separate selves as such when you descended to Earth, you have a certain sense of self, a certain sense of identity, a certain sense of who you are. Now, if you go back to the original story of the Garden of Eden in Genesis, you will see that it was said that Adam and Eve were not allowed to eat the forbidden fruit because if they did, they would surely die. And as I explain in my book in great detail, what that meant was that when you enter the duality consciousness, when you eat that forbidden fruit, then the sense of self you had before you ate the fruit will actually die. You may not even notice this because, especially when you are in this traumatic situation, but your sense of self that you had with you when you came to Earth died, and you were instantly reborn into another sense of self that was based on what you had experienced on Earth, meaning it was based on the duality consciousness. So once you were reborn into that sense of self, two things happened. First of all, you had forgotten your previous sense of self. You had forgotten the sense of self you had before you descended to Earth. And second of all, you were now looking at life from inside the cloud of duality, the cloud of unknowing, we might say. And therefore, you could no longer imagine what it was like to be outside of duality, to experience life without seeing through the filter of the dualistic consciousness. You simply could not imagine this with your mind. Now, you still had the ability as the conscious you to step outside of your four lower bodies, your outer mind, your separate selves, and experience that pure awareness, which is what it is like to be outside of duality. But because you were so wounded by the birth trauma, most of you were not able to do this for quite some time after your first embodiment, because you had to deal with this shock of the birth trauma. Now, what did you do as a result of being exposed to this trauma? Well, as we said, you created the primal self, but how did you do this? What is the primal self? Well, in order to create the primal self, you use the duality consciousness. And what is the subtle characteristic of the duality consciousness? We have hinted at it before, but I will attempt to explain it more directly. When you are in the duality consciousness, you can, as we have said, prove any point. Anything you want to prove, you can prove it. You can choose, for example, that the Christian religion is the superior religion, and by using the duality consciousness, you can prove it. You can also choose that scientific materialism is the superior way to look at life, and by using the duality consciousness, you can prove it, at least for yourself. You can prove it in such a way that you are experiencing that this is absolutely real. This is the way it is because your experience of this is absolutely real. You are experiencing the absolute reality that Christianity is the only true religion, or that scientific materialism is the only truth about life and the universe. But how do you experience this? How can you experience this? What is it that makes it possible to prove one thing with a duality consciousness, but makes it possible for another person to prove the opposite with a duality consciousness? Why is it possible that two people can have diametrically opposed viewpoints, but they both experience inside their own minds the absolute reality of what they think is the absolute truth? How is this possible? Well, this is the unique feature of the duality consciousness. How does this work? How do you prove for example, that Christianity is the only true religion and the only path to salvation. Well, the unique feature about duality is that it enables you to, as it says in Genesis, be as a God, knowing good and evil. You are knowing what is good and evil. You are defining what is good and evil. And how do you do this? Well, you define it by excluding something. In other words, in order to prove that Christianity is the superior religion, you take a certain viewpoint and you elevate that to the status of being an absolute truth that you never question. Now, there may be some other viewpoint that actually questions the validity that this is an absolute truth. But you are defining that as being untrue, evil, of the devil, and therefore something you can ignore. In other words, in order to define your truth in duality, in order to be the God of your own being and define what is good and evil, you are elevating one thing to be beyond questioning, and another thing you are putting down as something you do not need to consider. And then you, of course, go into the black and white thinking that there really is nothing in between. There's nothing in between these two. It is, as we have said before, Aristotelian logic that says a statement, an axiom is either true or untrue, and there's nothing in between. It is the principle of the excluded middle. Well, the Buddha called his path the middle way because it is the path of re-establishing the excluded middle, not in the sense that it's the midpoint between two dualistic extremes, but you realize that there are other ways of looking at life than these two extremes that you have defined. Now, sometimes we may have actually given our students the impression that the duality consciousness is something bad, something evil, perhaps even something defined by the fallen beings. And in a sense, it's true that the fallen beings have used the duality consciousness to define certain axioms, ideologies, theories, belief systems. So this is defined by the fallen beings. Many of the things you see on Earth, thought systems, are defined by the fallen beings. Nevertheless, the duality consciousness is just an offspring of the fact that the Creator has given all self-aware beings an unrestricted free will. So what you see is, as a result of this, is that the Creator has created this world of form, has defined certain parameters for this world of form. Then the Creator has, out of its own being, created certain beings that descended and took embodiment in the first sphere. They ascended, they defined the structures in the second sphere, sent extensions of themselves into the second sphere, and so forth and so on. So in your unascended sphere, there are spiritual beings in the ascended realm who created that sphere, defined parameters. You have the seven Elohim who created yours and defined parameters for how this planet was. So a new life stream starts out being a co-creator where you are creating within the framework that was defined by beings who are at higher levels of awareness than yourself. So you are always reacting to this. And this is how you grow. You use your free will to expand your sense of awareness from the point-like sense of awareness that you start with. But there comes that point, as I also describe in my book, where you need to become more self-sufficient, and instead of co-creating within a certain framework, you need to experiment with defining your own framework. And this is where the dualistic consciousness comes in. You can also look at this another way and say that when you are a new being, you don't have the awareness to question the environment you're in. But as you become more mature, more experienced, you come to a point where it's natural for you to begin to question. For example, if you are a new being created and took embodiment for the first time on Earth, you will experiment for some time with what you can co-create here on Earth. But there should naturally come a point where you begin to question, well, is Earth the only planet? Could a planet only be designed the way Earth is designed, or could it be designed in other ways? Are there other kinds of environments where I have different co-creative abilities, different creative options? And so it is natural as part of this that you begin to experiment with, well, is there an alternative to co-creating within the framework that has been defined for me by others? And that is where you then can begin to experiment with the duality consciousness. The duality consciousness really is, in its essence, simply what we have called the reality simulator. On Earth, as it is defined by the Elohim, there are only certain type of experiences that are possible. Now, this is not really necessarily a limitation, because in the original design, you couldn't actually be hurt by what you co-created. You couldn't live in poverty. You couldn't experience starving to death. You couldn't experiment fighting with other people and being killed by them. This was not part of the original design. Was this necessarily a limitation? Well, in a certain way it was, because the Earth was not originally designed to give you the experience of suffering. As the Buddha said, the first noble truth is that life is suffering. Life in duality is suffering. So you may say that there are certain life streams who come to a certain point where they start realizing that co-creating within the framework defined by higher minds means that there are certain experiences you cannot have. And so they formulate a desire to have those kind of experiences just to have a frame of reference, to know what it is like. Now, why is this allowed? Well, it's allowed, my beloved, because of free will. There is a point where you ascend. And when you ascend, you choose, consciously and knowingly, you choose to leave behind the potential that you could go into duality and act as a separate being. You are, so to speak, choosing to enter into the oneness of your Creator's creation. You're doing this knowingly and voluntarily. You are simply choosing to say, I am letting go permanently and forever of the potential to go into duality. That is when you can ascend to the spiritual realm where all other beings have made the same choice. And therefore, there is no room for duality, and there is no suffering, and there is no conflict, and no fighting, and no arguing, and all of these things. But you see, the question then becomes, how can you make that choice to leave duality behind forever if you haven't experienced what duality is? So, as you will see from my book, in the original mystery school for the original inhabitants of the earth, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was in the garden. It was in the mystery school because it was, as I explained, part of the initiation you were meant to have. But at the time, of course, there were not fallen beings on earth. So it was much easier for live streams to experiment with duality, to go into duality, and to come out of duality again. Now, what the fallen beings have done, those who fell from one sphere to the next, is that they have, so to speak, solidified the duality consciousness. They have created some structures in the duality consciousness that make it much more difficult to enter duality and go back out of duality. It is the concept of a catch-22 that once you are in, it's difficult to get out. And how does this work? Well, it really works the same way that I described. You can take one aspect of the options you can see in duality. They are all relative, but you can take one aspect and elevate it to the status of being absolutely true, and then you can take its polar opposite, because there are always two polarities, and demote it to being absolutely untrue. This is, again, just duality. You elevate one thing to something you don't question, you put something else down to something you can ignore. And when you have something you don't question and something else that questions what you don't question, that you ignore, you can prove anything. This means what? This means that in duality, you can have any experience you want. You can have the experience of being a separate being. And only when you see yourself as a separate being can you experience suffering. Because when you are connected, a connected being, connected to a higher presence or a spiritual teacher, you cannot experience suffering the way you experience suffering on earth. If you were to analyze suffering on earth, you will see that it springs from the sense that you are a separate being, you are alone, you are lost, or you could be lost, you are left somehow, you have been left behind by someone, whether you see it as God or something else. And this limited, separate self can suffer. In fact, it can only suffer. It can temporarily feel elated also, but even that will inevitably lead to suffering. In other words, what you call happiness on earth can only exist as a polar opposite to unhappiness. And so even when people supposedly are elated, as we said earlier, even though people become billionaires and have all the money they could ever use, they are still not at peace, because now that they have this, they are anxious that they could lose it. Because you cannot have something as a separate self without having the fear that you could lose it. So this is simply, again, duality. But in the original state of duality, you had something you elevated to being beyond questioning, and something else you demoted to something you could and should ignore. But there was always the possibility that you could simply say, but what if I don't ignore that thing? What if I actually look at it and look at how it questions what I consider to be an infallible truth? And if you did this, you would instantly see that what you had elevated as an infallible truth couldn't be the absolute truth, because if it was, it couldn't be questioned. So you see that there is one viewpoint, but there's also another viewpoint. And you can even come to see that if you change your perspective a little bit, you could see that what you had formerly put down could also be elevated to the status of an absolute truth, and what you had formerly elevated could be demoted to not being the truth. And that is why you can then see that other people can have the diametrically opposed view that you have, and they can be as convinced that they are right as you have convinced yourself that you are right. And once you begin to see this and question duality, well, then it's not so difficult to free yourself from duality. But what is it that the fallen beings have done? And they have not done this deliberately to manipulate others. They have become trapped in it themselves. Well, what they have done is that they have taken duality to a new level where it isn't just a matter of having an experience that seems real. Originally, duality is like the reality simulator. And duality is just an environment you go into and you put on these virtual reality goggles where you are seeing something on a screen inside the goggles and you can't see anything outside the goggles. So you go into duality, you elevate one thing to truth and then demote the opposite to error. And this is the same as putting on a specific type of virtual reality goggles that portray a certain environment. But it's fairly neutral. You may have something you see as true and something you see as untrue, but it just gives you that sense of reality. But there is another layer of duality. And this is, as we have talked about before, where instead of just saying that this is so and this is not so, you are adding the value judgment. This is right. This is wrong. This is good. This is evil. And these are other levels. There are actually two different levels of duality. The level of right and wrong introduces something entirely new. Now it is not just a matter of you having whatever experience you want. Now you can say that at the basic level of duality, you can have billions of people on a planet who have many different experiences that they all feel are real. But there's nothing really wrong about it. You can in fact have people who are having different experiences without being in conflict with each other, without trying to convince others that they should have a different experience than they are having. It's as if you have a group of people, you have 5 different people who have watched 5 different movies. And now they are talking about their movies and they are telling each other about these movies. But they are just sharing the experience they had while they were in the movie theater. There's no value judgment saying one movie was wrong and the other was right. But this is the next level that the fallen beings defined. They defined that some experiences you are having in the reality simulator are right and some are wrong. And this now introduces something that is much more difficult to get out of. Why is this so? Well, because let's say that you elevate Christianity to being the only true religion. You do this by ignoring all of the questions that might question the statement that Christianity is the only true religion. But on top of this, you are saying that your view that Christianity is right, is the only true religion, is right, and anything that questions that view is wrong. What does this mean? Instead of you having a fairly neutral experience that seems real while you're having it, but that you can fairly easily question and get out of, you now have made it much more difficult to get out of your experience. Why? Because you have made this statement that you were absolutely right by being a Christian. And anyone who questioned Christianity or was not a Christian, they were absolutely wrong. How can you get out of this state of mind? Well, you can only do so by questioning the Christian religion. But if you question the Christian religion and come to see that it was not the only true religion after all, what does that mean? It means that you were now wrong for thinking it was the only true religion. So do you see that, in a sense, you could say that at the basic level, duality is still a fairly neutral environment. You elevate something to being true and some things for being untrue, but you don't really have the value judgment that other people are bad people or are wrong for not accepting your evaluation. You are just having an experience and it feels real to you while you are having it, but it's not so difficult to question it. Once you add the value judgment of right and wrong, there's now a risk involved. You are having the experience that you are absolutely right because you are a Christian. You are a true follower of Jesus. You belong to the only true church, be it the Catholic Church or any other. And this gives you a certain experience that you cannot have outside of duality. And what is that experience? That is that you are better than other people because you belong to the only true religion and therefore you are right and they are wrong. This is also an experience you can have in duality. Again, I'm not trying to say that it's wrong of beings to experiment with their free will in duality and have that experience. But you see, in duality, there's always a certain consequence. And when you add the value judgment that you can be right or wrong, then it becomes much more difficult for you to get out of that state. Because in order to get out of the sense that you are a Christian and you are right and all other people are wrong, what do you have to do? You have to question Christianity. And then what does that mean? That means that you were wrong for thinking it was the only true religion. Your viewpoint that Christianity is the only religion was wrong because it wasn't an absolute truth. And so that means you have now become wrong. And what the fallen beings have done, of course, from day one, when they went into this level of duality, is that they have been judging everything. We have described how in previous spheres that were unascended, the fallen beings, some fallen beings had set themselves up on certain planets where one fallen being, for example, was the undisputed leader. And all of the other potentially billions of life streams on that planet were actually worshiping that fallen being as a god, as you have indeed seen some civilizations on Earth that worship their leader as a god. This is simply the pattern that the fallen beings created. We have also described that there came a point where the sphere was ready to ascend, and we now confronted these beings who were not yet fallen. We confronted them with the fact that they had created an artificial environment that was out of touch with reality. At that moment, these beings realized that what they had created, the sense of them being elevated to this status of godlike status, was unreal. It was just a fiction, as everything in an undescended sphere is a fiction. And so, if they had been neutral about this, they could easily have stepped out of it. But because they had gone to that second level of defining something as right or wrong, they now had this brief moment, this interval almost beyond a split second, where they had to look at the reality, and therefore they reasoned, I was wrong. I was wrong to set myself up this way. Now, some of them allowed this moment to linger on in time, where they acknowledged that they were wrong, and they asked for help to get out of this. And they, of course, received that help, and many of them ascended with their sphere. But there were some that did not allow this moment to linger. As soon as they, so to speak, looked into the abyss of this I was wrong and self-condemnation, they instantly shifted into denial. They denied that they were wrong. And now, what did they create? Well, they created another dualistic polarity. And there was one thing that was elevated to being an absolute truth that they never needed to question. And there was an opposite that was put down as being an absolute error that they could completely ignore. And what was it they elevated? It was this: I cannot be wrong. I cannot be wrong. This is an absolute truth that they never need to question. And anyone who questions them and their viewpoints, they can ignore, or they can label as being bad people, evil people, and so forth and so on. So, of course, they couldn't remain in their sphere with this consciousness, and that's why they fell into the next unascended sphere that was being created. But they then started in that unascended sphere with this mindset: I cannot be wrong. No matter what I do, no matter what I say, no matter what I believe, it cannot be wrong because I cannot be wrong. And so you now have these people, and some of them are an embodiment on Earth, that psychologists have started calling narcissists. And the characteristic here is that they cannot be wrong. They cannot admit that they are wrong. But the question is, how can you then grow? Duality allows you to go into a state of illusion, and that illusion gives you whatever experience you want to have. The idea is that you can have that experience for as long as you want. There comes a point where you've had enough of it, and now you just go out of it again. But when you add the dynamic of the fallen consciousness, then it is very difficult to go out of it again, because you cannot admit that you were wrong. In a sense, as we have said, everything that you can create with duality is an illusion. There's nothing inherently wrong with this, because, as we said, a reality simulator is meant to give you an experience. And it doesn't matter that you are wearing these reality goggles and what you see inside the goggles is a computer-generated environment and not the real world, if you can call the physical realm on Earth a real world. It doesn't matter, because it's still giving you the experience. And when you have walked around looking at this computer-generated world long enough and you are tired of it, well, you just take off the goggles. But once you add this evaluation or this determination, I cannot be wrong, how can you escape your illusions? Because what does it take for you to escape an illusion? What happens when you take off the goggles and you see that there is a quote unquote real world outside the computer generated world? Well, you realize that the computer-generated world was an illusion. So you have to admit that this was not the highest reality. It was an illusion. So in duality, you go in, you elevate something to the status that Christianity is the only true religion, and you can live in this state of mind, you can live in this experience for a number of lifetimes. But how do you get out of it again? Well, you must acknowledge that the belief that Christianity was the only true religion was an illusion. Fairly easy to do if you don't have this overlay of the fallen mind that says it's wrong to be wrong. Because when you think that admitting that what you believed was an illusion is wrong and makes you wrong, and when you have this absolute belief that you can never be wrong because some unspecified disaster will happen if you're wrong, then how can you admit that the Christian religion is not the only true religion? Now, for many non-fallen beings, there is an easier way out of this. For example, we have said that many people have lived a lifetime where they grew up in a Christian environment, and they believed the Christian promise that if they were good Christians, they would be guaranteed to be saved after that, which was portrayed as their only lifetime. So here they are, their body dies, the soul rises to whatever level it can rise to, and it experiences that it still has awareness. But it also experiences that this is not what it saw as the heaven world, and it's now surrounded by loving guides who tell it that it has to go into embodiment again on earth instead of entering heaven. So, after having experienced this for a certain number of lifetimes, many people will have come into embodiment, not remembering this consciously, but having a distrust of the Christian religion and the promise it is making, because they have experienced that the promise isn't real. But for a fallen being, this is almost impossible to do. The fallen being has this absolute determination that it must never look into that abyss of being wrong. And what happened to some of these fallen beings when they had that moment of realization where they saw into this abyss was that they literally saw that the duality consciousness forms almost a bottomless pit. There is almost no limit to how far they can fall into that abyss with the duality consciousness. And it scared them, and that is why they went into denial, so that they could ignore that they could be wrong and that they could fall into this abyss. And this determination was made in a higher sphere, which makes it not impossible to question in the next sphere they fall into, but it makes it very difficult for them. Because in order to question it, they will have to be willing to look at the potential that they could be wrong. And they will even have to question why they have this absolute terror of being wrong. Now, even though this is a difficult mental box to escape from, there is another level that you also see on Earth. And this is the level where you are not just saying that something is right or wrong at the personal level. You're not just saying that a person could be wrong in having a certain viewpoint, but you are saying that beyond the personal level, there is a larger context where you could be wrong. This is what we have called the epic mindset, where you have this epic overlay that not only is Christianity the only true religion, but it's the only religion that can guarantee your salvation. And if you are not a Christian and not a good Christian, you will not be saved. You can even have other layers of this where you look at the planet as a whole or the universe as a whole and say that there is an epic cause that must be fulfilled for the earth to be saved. And if it is not fulfilled, then the earth or the entire universe is doomed to destruction. Many different individual versions of this epic mindset, but you all know what I'm talking about. So once you have the epic mindset that you are not just wrong at the personal level, but you are wrong at this epic level, then it becomes even more difficult to escape this. And you can again step back from this and you can look at it from a neutral perspective, which is, of course, what I do in my role as the great initiator. And you can say, well, but again, the epic mindset is just one possibility of what can be defined through the dualistic consciousness. You can define yourself as a God who knows better than God how the universe works, or how the universe should have been designed. And therefore you can define that you are on a quest to become a God. Perhaps you even have already attained that level where you are now superior to the Creator who created this entire world of form. You know better than the Creator how the world should have been designed. And therefore, you should really be allowed to be God for the entire universe. Now, for some strange reason that you find it somewhat difficult to explain, the superior God of the universe has not recognized your achievement. But if you can get all people on planet Earth to recognize this, then you can at least maintain that sense that you really have this kind of superior achievement. And this is why you see people who attempt to set themselves up as having this godlike status that cannot be gainsaid. And again, if you look at this neutrally, you can say, well, it's just one of the experiences that's possible through duality. But you also have to look at it when you look at it neutrally and see that there is always a consequence. There's always a price to be paid. And that is that the deeper you go into these layers of duality, the more tension you will have in your being. Because in a sense, what you are doing is you are using the duality consciousness to elevate yourself to gradually higher status. There is an old folk's tale in many European nations, and it has various versions, but in one of them it is that a poor fisherman goes fishing and catches a flounder. But the flounder is a magic flounder. And it tells the fisherman that if he will let it go, he will be granted 3 wishes. So he accepts the deal, goes home and tells his wife. They are living in a mud hut. And he tells his wife, who first refuses to believe him, but then, just to test it out, she wishes that she lived in a big mansion. And instantly, the wish is fulfilled, or rather, in some versions, the fisherman goes out to sea, calls the flounder, and relays his wife's wish. And by the time he gets home, it has been fulfilled, and she lives in a mansion. After some time of really enjoying living in this mansion, she becomes dissatisfied. Now she wants more. So now she says to her husband to go to the flounder and says, now she wants to be queen and live in the royal castle. And the fisherman rows out to sea, calls the flounder, relays the wish, and by the time he gets home, lo and behold, there is the wife living as the queen in a castle. And she is really happy and thrilled about this. But after some time, she again becomes dissatisfied. This is not enough for her. So now she calls her husband and says, go and tell the flounder that now I want to be God. And then the fisherman rows out, calls the flounder, relays the wish, and instantly there is a big thunderclap, and the wife is now back into the mud hut where she started. Because there are some wishes that cannot be granted to the duality consciousness. But nevertheless, you get the central point here. When you go into duality, you seek to elevate yourself, often in comparison to other people, and this is what the fallen beings have done from the moment they fell. They seek to elevate, they even did it before they fell, but especially after. So they seek to elevate themselves more and more to a higher and higher status. And when they find themselves in a situation such as on planet Earth, where they achieve some high status as a dictator or king or emperor or whatever, they naturally feel a sense of elation. But that sense of elation cannot exist on its own. It cannot be fulfilled by itself. It cannot be enough in itself, because there's always an opposite dualistic polarity. The higher you climb, the harder you fall. There's all this potential you could fall, you could lose what you have. And that is why, in a sense, the fallen beings get trapped in this seeking to elevate themselves higher and higher. And you could say, well, why do they want to be the status of God? Well, it's because they think that this is the only status, this is the ultimate elevation from which they cannot fall. So the fallen beings are trapped in thinking that by using the duality consciousness, they can elevate themselves to a status from which they cannot fall. There is no opposite. But as we have explained to you many, many times, this cannot be done in duality, because you cannot create something in duality that does not have an opposite polarity. So the more you elevate yourself, the more tense you become, because the more you have the specter that you could fall, and as high as you have elevated yourself above some medium level, you will inevitably be able to fall that far below that medium level. So the higher you go up, the greater is the chasm, the deeper is the abyss that you could fall into. So do you see what the fallen beings are actually doing? They are using duality to build themselves up to a point where they are standing exactly where they stood in the moment before they fell, where they saw into the abyss. They have now recreated the abyss, but they have created it themselves with their own state of consciousness. And so, what is the inevitable outcome of setting yourself up on a planet like Earth to have this superior status? It is tension. It is intense tension. You who are not fallen beings simply cannot imagine the tension that a fallen being has inside its own mind. You might study some of these beings and read some of their biographies, and you can get some idea of it. You can see how Hitler became more and more tense, even to the point where he had to take various kinds of drugs to even function. He became so tense by the prospect that he could lose the war that he almost couldn't function psychologically. You can see how Stalin became more and more tense, and it was expressed through the paranoia that he thought everybody was trying to betray him, and therefore he had to kill virtually all of the people that were near him. You can see exactly the same in the United States, where Donald Trump has become increasingly more tense during the last 4 years, and especially with the prospect that he could lose the election. And so he has become more and more impulsive, more and more angry, has a tendency to yell at people. He has become more and more prone to firing those that will not support his sense that he cannot be wrong. And the only thing that keeps him functioning is that he takes comfort in the fact that there were 70 million people who voted for him, and therefore there are 70 million people who believe he cannot be wrong. Now you see what I have been saying. The fallen beings have this absolute belief that they cannot be wrong. And therefore they feel that they can ignore those who do not agree with them, who have a different view, or who maybe even question them. And you can see this in many of these dictators. Stalin attempted to kill all those that he felt were threatening him, even if they weren't actually threatening him. Hitler also removed those who were against him. Donald Trump has fired those who were against him. But these dictators will, for a certain time, actually be able to deal with those who are questioning them by labeling them as bad people. They are wrong, they are evil, and therefore the fact that they are being opposed will for a time actually validate and affirm their self-image, that they are so special, that they are so high. Because naturally, if you have the truth, those who are the bad people will not be able to see this, and therefore the fact that they are opposing you for a time just seems to prove that you are right. And Donald Trump has been doing this for quite some time, but the price you pay for this is that the tension increases. And there comes a breaking point where people cannot deal with it anymore. Hitler broke down. All narcissists are working their way towards this breaking point. And the more risk they take by elevating themselves to some superior position, the more tension there will be, and the faster they move towards the inevitable breaking point. Because it is, unfortunately, for fallen beings, the only way they can get out of being trapped in the fallen consciousness is a complete breakdown. And I can assure you that if Donald Trump had been re-elected, you would have seen his mental state, his mental health, literally deteriorate in front of the world's eyes over these next 4 years. It is possible that he had been able to avoid a complete breakdown or been able to hide it, but it is also possible that he would have suffered a complete mental breakdown while being in the presidential office. And I can assure you that this would have been much more embarrassing for Donald Trump personally than being defeated in this election. Therefore, his defeat in this election was at the personal level a mercy, a grace. And even at the national level, it was also a grace in the sense that this would have been, first of all, very difficult to deal with for his followers. It would also have been difficult for the nation because he might have made some very erratic decisions, some more erratic decisions, but it would also have been very embarrassing for the United States on the world scale. And so, where does all this lead to? Why am I taking you into this long tale? Well, it all points back to you as Ascended Master students. You need to recognize in yourself that you have grown up on a planet where this dynamic that I have described has been in existence for a long time. You have been exposed to it, most likely since your original birth trauma, which is for a very long time for many embodiments. It's inevitable that you have taken this on, and you can find the spiritual path, you can follow the spiritual path for a while, but you cannot reach beyond a certain level of Christhood unless you deal with this. And the first thing you need to deal with is to realize the dynamics of the duality consciousness, what we have said. Any relative viewpoint can be elevated to the status of seeming absolute, because there are certain things you don't question and certain things you ignore. When you begin to grasp this dynamic, then you can begin to look at the planet, you can look at yourself and say, well, but listen, there are fallen beings on this planet. They have created this value judgment of right and wrong. They have created the epic mindset and all of these epic illusions. It's inevitable that I have grown up in an environment based on this. It's inevitable that I have taken this on. It's inevitable that I have created separate selves based on these illusions. But so what? Do I really need to do what the fallen beings are doing and be unwilling to admit that I had some illusion? Do I really need to go into this dynamic and feel that I will never admit that one of my beliefs was an illusion, because then I would be wrong? Do I really need to go into the epic mindset of thinking that if I admit that I had believed in an illusion and elevated to the status of infallibility, then I have made some epic mistake? Do I really need to go into this fallen mindset when I am a person who is sincerely striving for Christhood and my ascension? And of course, my beloved, you don't. You don't. You may have gone into it, you may have been trapped in it because you've been exposed to it over many lifetimes. But with all the teachings we have given you, with all the tools we have given you, you can come to see, and fairly quickly, that it is not you who has these beliefs that you must not be wrong, that you must not admit you have been wrong. It is separate selves that have these beliefs. Those separate selves are not you. You are not them. You are more than them. As the conscious you are pure awareness. You are not defined by anything on earth, which means that any of these selves, no matter how loudly they scream that you will die if you let them go, they are not right. You will not die when a separate self dies. And when you acknowledge this, when you experience this, when you experience a glimpse of pure awareness, then you know it's true. You can let a separate self die and you will not die. But you will be reborn into a higher sense of self. And when you continue to do this, what will happen to you? Well, what will happen is what has happened to this messenger and a number of people who have used the teachings on the primal self and how to heal your spiritual traumas. You come to a point where the tension, the inner tension that you have felt all of your life, and many of you for 2 million years of embodiments on this planet, it begins to dissolve. And suddenly you can feel, as this messenger has described, that you suddenly sense this release. Something lets go. And you have this realization, oh, I don't have to. And then whatever comes after that is specific to your situation and your beliefs. But many of you who are avatars have the same dynamic. You have the sense that you have to do something on earth. You are here to accomplish something. And if you don't accomplish it, it's meaningless. And if you question the fact that you are here to do something good, then you fall into the abyss. You would have been wrong for coming here. But you were not wrong for coming here. You came here to have a certain experience. Nothing wrong with that. It may be that the experience you wanted to have was to be the prince on the white horse who came riding into town, shot the fallen beings with your 6 gun, and saved the day. And it may be that you have not accomplished that, but you have still had an experience of being in embodiment. And therefore, it is possible for you to come to see that you didn't actually come to Earth. This is what this messenger realized. He didn't come to Earth to achieve a particular outer result. He came to Earth to overcome a certain self that he had built before he even came to Earth, a certain illusion that he had built. He came to let go of something. He didn't come to change the Earth. He came to change himself by letting go of a certain viewpoint. And what is that viewpoint for most avatars? Well, it is that you have lived on a natural planet. You have risen yourself to a higher sense of self. Now, as a natural part of your curiosity, you begin to ask yourself this question. Is a natural planet the only kind of planet? Is this the only kind of environment in which I could exercise my co-creative abilities? Are there other types of planets that are different, that give you a different experience, perhaps even a different creative opportunity? And then as a result of this curiosity, you become aware that there's something called unnatural planets. And you look at these unnatural planets from afar, and you are struck by the immense contrast between a natural planet and an unnatural planet. On a natural planet, there's no warfare, there's no conflict, there's no torture, there's no rape, there's no violence, there's no cheating, there is none of all of these human conflicts that cause so much suffering. And when you see this, you're shocked because you had never considered that free will could be taken so far. And what do? Well, you haven't encountered fallen beings, but you still, from your viewpoint of a natural planet, something happens in your being. You feel that, but people shouldn't be suffering like that. You shouldn't be living in these terrible conditions that cause them so much suffering. And you feel, as a result of your basic humanity, you feel a sense of compassion for these people. And then you formulate in your being a desire to help them, to go down to Earth to demonstrate that there's an alternative to all of this. But you may not look at this with the value judgment of the fallen beings, but you still in your mind have a certain concept that what's happening on a non-natural planet shouldn't be happening. It should be stopped. And you should go down there and stop it. You may not see it as it's wrong what's happening on a natural planet. You may not think that God was wrong for allowing free will to go that far. God should have set up some kind of safety net so people couldn't descend beyond the soul level. You may not feel this way, or even though some avatars do feel this way. But you still think that planet Earth should not be allowed to continue in this state. Someone must do something. Someone must go down there and stop the suffering. And who is that someone? Well, of course, you decide that you will be that someone. So you descend with the intent of accomplishing specific outer goals on Earth. And be careful here. Be careful to realize the subtlety. The Creator does not want people on Earth to suffer. We of the Ascended Masters do not want people on Earth to suffer. We certainly do not want them to continue to suffer for an indefinite future. We want the suffering to be transcended on Earth. How can it be transcended? Well, someone must descend to Earth and demonstrate personal Christhood, and thereby demonstrate that there's an alternative to the duality consciousness that is the root of all suffering. The original inhabitants of the Earth cannot do this on their own. So someone must descend who has the ability to go to Earth, embody here, be trapped in the duality consciousness, but still raise themselves above it and demonstrate the path to Christhood. So it is not that we do not want avatars to descend to earth. It is not that we are saying it is wrong of you to descend to earth. But there comes that point on your path to Christhood where you need to begin to question what brought you to earth and question the view you had from afar. Whereas we said you could not imagine what it was like to be in the duality consciousness. And therefore you could not understand, why don't people just stop all this conflict and suffering? Why don't they just change society and civilization in the entire planet? You simply could not imagine that they are not able to do this because they are trapped in these layers and layers of illusions. So you had to go down there to experience it yourself. Experience how difficult it is. How difficult is the path of raising yourself beyond this. But you had to have a motivation for doing this. And it was that you wanted to accomplish a certain outer goal. But there comes that point on your path where you need to let go of this desire to accomplish anything on earth. You need to just let it die, because you cannot ascend while you still have the desire to accomplish something on earth. And that means you cannot demonstrate the fullness of the path to Christhood where you raise yourself to the point of the ascension. Because as long as you have the desire to change something on earth, what are you doing? The fallen beings, many of them are seeking to attain power because they want to elevate themselves to this superior status where they no longer feel threatened. As an avatar, this has no appeal to you whatsoever. You do not seek power for that reason. But you can easily become trapped into seeking power in order to accomplish the goal you set for yourself and alleviate suffering. Because you think that if you have enough power, then you will be able to alleviate suffering and change society. But as long as you have this desire, you cannot rise beyond a certain level of Christhood, because you will be trapped in seeking that outer power so you can change the earth. This is demonstrated by the life of Jesus, where there were many people in Israel who wanted him to take up the role that they thought it was his destiny to fulfill, namely that of being the king of Israel who could defeat the Romans and restore Israel to being an independent country. Jesus faced that temptation. That is why he withdrew to the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. Before he had fully resolved his own desire to have the power of being a king who could change society. And that is why he was able to demonstrate the path to Christhood, which is that you let go of old worldly power and you seek spiritual power. You acknowledge, I can of my own self do nothing. The Father within me, he doeth the work. This is Christhood. This is the path to Christhood. Not that you attain power to promote this or that change on earth, but that you demonstrate the path that is the alternative to the duality consciousness. This is your highest potential as an avatar on earth. Some of you are the original inhabitants who have risen to the level where this is also your potential. There comes that point where you need to step up to this level of Christ discernment, where you begin to see this dynamic. And therefore you do not fall for the temptation where you saw Jesus being tempted by the devil who took him up to a high place and showed him all the kingdoms of this world and says, all this will I give you if you will fall down and worship me. You can rebuke the devil, or you can simply ignore the devil and walk away, letting the devil, or rather that separate self in your own being, simply die, simply fade away. You can surrender it, let it go, let it die, and turn around and face the light of your I am presence and continue walking towards that light without being distracted by anything on earth. This is Christhood. All of you can start demonstrating it at whatever level you are at by looking at your attachments, looking at what is it that pulls you into a certain pattern, reactionary pattern on earth, and then deciding to resolve that self so you can rise above that pattern. Thereby you demonstrate a step on the path. Even if you're not at the 96th level, you can do this. But those of you who have the potential to move beyond the 96th level, who are already facing that initiation of moving beyond the 96th level, overcoming the focus on self, you can use these teachings to step up to that higher level. What will be the benefit? It will be that you start diminishing the tension in your own being, until you can come to that point where you can be at peace being on earth, at peace being in a dense physical body with all the limitations that has, at peace being in your own mind, being the person you are, being at the level of the path that you are at, while continually striving to go to the next level. Many of you will be able to look back at your life in this lifetime and see that from as far back as you can remember, you had this inner tension. This is not because you are fallen beings, but it is because you had the sense that there was something you had to do on earth and you hadn't done it. You hadn't accomplished it. The only way to overcome that tension is to look at what you thought you were here to accomplish, what you thought you had to do on earth, and then let it go. Then you can be on earth without the tension, and then you can actually accomplish something that will raise the collective consciousness and raise the earth. Jesus had the potential. He had reached a high level of Christhood. He had demonstrated a certain mastery of mind over matter. He had the potential to become a mighty warrior king who could have defeated the Roman Empire. But he would accomplish nothing for the ongoing growth of this planet by doing so. But he did accomplish something significant by choosing the path to Christhood. I know very well, as you do also, that his example was destroyed by the fallen beings, his teachings were distorted, and therefore he didn't accomplish as much as could have been accomplished. But he still accomplished something, and that is the reason why this planet is where it is at today, instead of staying in the medieval ages with all the warfare and conflict and poverty and misery that was there at the time. And so you too can accomplish something by choosing that path to Christhood. But it requires you to be willing to acknowledge that you do not have the ultimate level of Christ discernment right now. And that the only way to increase your Christ discernment is to come to see that some of the beliefs you have right now, that you think should not be questioned, are in fact illusions, and they need to be questioned. And you will also only make progress on the path to Christhood by confronting this momentum and this separate self that projects at you that you are wrong if you admit that you believed in an illusion. and the entire epic mindset. This is also accomplishing something truly significant on the planet, because the more people rise above these illusions, the more they pull up on the collective consciousness and create this upward spiral that was truly took a significant turn with Gautama and his embodiment as the Buddha, and another significant turn with Jesus, and has been reinforced by others since. And now you are at the point where you have the potential to add your momentum to this upgoing spiral. But it does require you to pass the initiations that we have now outlaid for you in a clearer way than has ever been done before. Not that we are necessarily done, because we have more to say, but still we have already said enough for some of you to make that leap to the higher levels of Christhood, where you don't have the fear of falling or being wrong. You don't have the tension inside, because you know that you can and you will continue to take one step at a time until you reach that 144th level, and then you will see through that illusion. You will make that decision to walk through that gate whereby you leave the earth behind permanently and you enter the ascended realm with an entirely different state of consciousness and perspective than you would have had if you had not descended and taken embodiment on a dense planet like Earth, if you had not confronted the duality consciousness as you have done. So with this, I will end this discourse, which I know has been long, but nevertheless, time is not. When you are truly allowing yourself to experience the flow of the Spirit. And so I thank you for your patience, for your kindness in being willing to endure this long discourse. You might take notes that in my decree there is a sentence that talks about the art of kindness to restore. It is my goal to restore the art of kindness on earth. And I am looking for those who also feel that this is a goal for them. I wanted to give some comments based on Maitreya's dictation, because his dictation sort of very well described the path or the process that I've been going through, in a sense, all of my life, but certainly for the past 44 years, where I've been aware of the spiritual path. And I can remember, when I think back, how it was in my childhood, where I had this constant tension that he was talking about. I even had periods in my childhood where I had these tics, these involuntary movements. I would wrinkle my nose, or I would, what was it? I would do something with my head or something. And I was what you would call a very nervous child. And it wasn't anything outer. It wasn't that my parents were causing it, or that there was anything in my outer situation. It was simply an inner tension that I had with me from past lives. And I have met many other spiritual people that I have felt the same way. And so what happened to me was that when I found my first spiritual movement, which was the Transcendental Meditation movement, when I was 18 years old, it was in 76. It was the past millennium, a long time ago. I can see this dynamic that I had this sense that I couldn't be wrong, or that my intuition couldn't be wrong. And I very much felt my entire society was so negative towards spirituality. My family was very negative towards spirituality. And I just felt that I couldn't be wrong. I couldn't have been wrong in going into that movement. And then after a few years, when I started seeing that there were certain things that weren't really the highest there, it was really a trauma for me to leave that movement, because I felt that I had been wrong in going into it, and my intuition had been wrong in guiding me. Up until then, I'd always felt I could trust my intuition. And now I felt that it was my intuitive guidance that made me go into TM, but now I thought it was wrong because TM wasn't the highest movement. And it took me some time to realize that my intuition had shown me that I should join the TM movement. But my intuition hadn't told me that this was an ultimate spiritual movement or the highest spiritual movement. That was something, an overlay that my outer mind had created. And so that was a very important realization for me, because it helped me with this idea that you can be wrong for doing something. And really, I started realizing at some point that following the spiritual path on the planet we are on, in the time we live in, is very, very complex. We've had many, many lifetimes on Earth. We're not consciously aware of those lifetimes. So we aren't always conscious of, to use the words we're using today, what separate selves we have created in those past lifetimes. And sometimes we need to experience a particular outer situation because it stirs up a separate self that we have created perhaps many lifetimes ago. So this means that we have to experience that situation. Now, in some cases, it may be that we just need to experience that situation for a very short time. And then that self is stirred up, we look at it, we deal with it, we make a better decision and go beyond it. And it's almost like the outer mind can't wrap itself around, why did I have to do this? Why did I have to experience this? Why did I have to do something that now seems unnecessary or seems like it was a mistake? And so what I started eventually realizing was that it's really kind of meaningless to evaluate our spiritual path based on that mindset of, was it a mistake or was it not a mistake? Because I realized that in order to make progress, in order to overcome certain illusions, we have to experience a particular situation. And we may only need to have that experience for a short time, but it resolves something. And once we've resolved it, it has fulfilled its purpose, and we can move on to something else. But the world has this attitude that when you have started something, you have to finish it. This was one of my father's big things. When I started one study at university and then stopped after a year, he was so angry because when you start something, you have to finish it. And there's so much in the world that you have to have an outer reason for what you're doing. So I see in myself, in my life, how I have had this very what would you call it? A very sort of, some would say, scattered and disharmonious life, where I've gone from one situation to another. I've had several different marriages. I've lived in different countries, at different jobs. I went through getting an education as an architect that I've never used, and all of these outer things. And I've seen this in many other spiritual people. We move very quickly from situation to situation. And there's always this projection from other people or from the world that it's wrong of us to be in these situations. If we don't stay with something, it must have been a mistake. But why do we have to think that way? If you have to go into a particular job situation or live a particular place or have a particular relationship in order to have the experience that helps you resolve something, why is that wrong? You're taking a major step forward on your personal path. And once you have taken that step forward, why should you stay in the situation? Why do you need to keep the same job for 40 years, as my parents' generation did? Why do you need to take an education and then use it for the rest of your life? Maybe you just needed a certain experience from taking that education, and that was enough. You don't need the experience of having the job for 40 years. Maybe you need to be in a certain relationship in order to have a certain experience and come to a certain resolution in your mind. And then once you have reached that resolution, the relationship has fulfilled its purpose and you can move on. Why do we have to see it as always being wrong? And this is one of the realizations I've come to, that my goal in this lifetime is to make as much spiritual progress as I can, hopefully, which I feel is realistic, qualify for my ascension, but also do as much service as I can for the Ascended Masters while I'm still in embodiment. But in order to fulfill that goal, I can't allow myself to be stuck at any level. I have to move on, and I have to continue to move on. And so, what's wrong with moving on? This is what Christhood is about. This is what the path is about. It's about moving on, leaving things behind. Let the dead bury their dead. Give away all your possessions and come follow me. Be willing to lose your life for my sake. This is what Jesus said 2,000 years ago, because we need to demonstrate that nothing on this earth is more important than our progress on the path. Now, to go back to the tension I started out with, when I found the TM movement, it actually added to the tension, even though the meditation has some calming effect for a time. But there also came a point where now just the dynamics of the movement itself and being involved with other people and taking these courses I took, it added a certain tension, because in the TM movement, there was a goal you had to reach. You had to become a TM teacher. You had to take these expensive courses in Switzerland in order to get there, and all of this stuff. Then when I left the TM movement, that increased the tension. Now I felt this enormous tension that I had made this mistake and I'd been fooled into going into this movement and all of these things. But I worked through that over some time and over some years, actually. And then I found the Ascended Masters teachings in the form of the Summit Lighthouse. And when I look back at it, I can see that going into the Summit Lighthouse, and especially traveling, leaving Denmark and going to America, not knowing really how I was going to sustain myself there and make a living there, or even be able to stay there for immigration purposes, it increased my level of tension enormously. And I'm not blaming anyone for this. This was my psychology and my reaction. But I will say this, that one of the masters was talking about the Summit Lighthouse having a very judgmental culture. But what I would say is that the Summit Lighthouse as an organization was incredibly tense. There was just an unbelievable tension in the people, among the people, in the organization in general. And it was all the way from Elizabeth Clare Prophet and down. There was just incredible tension. And I'm not trying to say that this was bad or people were immature or whatever. But what I will say is that for me, it started becoming clear that regardless of the outer organization, it wasn't that the outer organization caused my tension. I had been attracted to the organization because I had the inner tension. And by being in the organization and seeing it out pictured, I had the opportunity to deal with it, confront it, and overcome it. So there came a point where I started realizing that I had to overcome the tension. And I think it started probably in the early 1990s, where first I realized that I was using Decrease as an excuse for not dealing with my psychology. So I decided to go into therapy. But I also came to some understanding of the Buddha, and that the path that the Buddha offered was the path of overcoming your attachments. And I came to realize that it's my attachments that creates the tension. I'm attached to something, I'm attached to a certain outcome, and as long as it isn't fulfilled, then I'm tense. And so this was sort of part of the process where I started questioning a lot of things. And what I'm trying to say here is that the process where I started consciously working on overcoming my tension started in the early 1990s. But it wasn't completed until much later. So it's not something you can just snap your fingers and easily overcome, because it requires you to look at many things in your psychology and overcome them. But the important thing is it can be done. Now, for me, an important step on the path for me was that I had this experience I described where I was transported to the Alpha and Omega's retreat in the Central Sun, and I experienced Alpha and Omega, and I saw beyond them to what I perceived as the Creator. And what I realized from that experience is that God, the Creator, has an unconditional acceptance of me. I saw this unconditional love, but it was also an acceptance of me. So it gave me a frame of reference that beyond anything on earth, beyond other people's opinions or my own opinions, there is a being that is my source, and that source accepts me unconditionally for who I am. That being is, of course, your source as well, and it accepts you as unconditionally as it accepts me. Now, you may not have experienced this, so it may just be something I'm telling you. Maybe it doesn't help you, I don't know. Maybe it's something that can help you. Because what I started doing was I started realizing that I wasn't accepting myself as God accepted me. Now, at the time, I didn't have the concept of the conscious you. But what I had experienced when I was experiencing the Creator, I was not in my outer state of mind when this happened. I was beyond my outer state of mind. I was in a completely neutral state of awareness. I was in that environment experiencing Alpha and Omega, but I just experienced. There was no thought process going on in my mind, evaluating everything, analyzing, judging everything. It was just neutral awareness, which is what the masters call pure awareness. You're just experiencing without evaluating, judging, analyzing. There's no, you're completely in the experience. It's not that you're standing outside of the experience, which is happening to your body, but there's a part of your mind that's evaluating and analyzing the experience. That's not how it was. So what I realized was that God's acceptance of me was the real me, the core of my being. And it was not my outer personality. I knew that. I never for a second felt that, oh, I must be special because I had this experience. It was actually a very humbling experience, because I realized that God accepts the core of my being, but God didn't accept the outer personality, because that's not me, that's not real. And so that's when I sort of started really separating myself from this outer personality and realizing that I needed to come to a point where I could accept myself. And I did work on that over several years, and I made some progress on it. But still, I had this tendency to judge other people and judge myself that was also so common in the Summit Lighthouse, which again was why I was attracted to the Summit Lighthouse. It wasn't that the Summit produced this in me. I was attracted to the Summit because I had this in my psychology, and that's why I needed to see it outplayed so I could deal with it. So the next big really event for me was in 2009 when I separated from my second wife. And she and a group of people started attacking me on the internet with websites and Facebook and emails. And really what they were attempting to do, if you look at it neutrally, was a kind of psychological warfare. They were trying to portray me as being absolutely wrong, having done something epically wrong. I was no longer a messenger. I was no longer in contact with the real masters and all of these things. And I very quickly realized I couldn't help these people, because whatever I said to them, they wouldn't even listen to it. So I stopped focusing my attention on it, and I started doing what I've basically done most of my life, looking at myself. What does my reaction to this situation say about what's unresolved in my psychology? And so I realized that I actually had an attachment to being seen by others as a good person. Now, from a realistic perspective, I am what you call a good person normally. I never deliberately hurt anybody, and I have no evil intentions towards anybody. But here was a group of people that were accusing me of being the opposite. And I realized that even though what they were accusing me of wasn't true in many cases, and I could easily have defended myself and refuted what they said, I decided not to do that. I decided just to look at myself and say, why am I reacting to this? And I realized I had this attachment. I want to be seen as a good person, as a person who has good intentions. And part of this is also that in order to be seen as a good person, I can't have made some really serious mistake. I can't make some really bad mistakes. And I think this is something that was very much also in the Summit Lighthouse culture, because in the Summit you had this concept of being tested, being initiated. You were always on the path of initiation. You're always being tested, and you could fail your tests. And the masters were portrayed as being more strict, more disciplinarian, and they would expose you and scold you if you failed your test. That was how it was seen in the culture. And so I realized that there was this underlying belief that if you made a really serious mistake, you couldn't be on the path anymore. You wouldn't really be a Chela of the masters. And also that you wouldn't be accepted by other people. And I didn't realize at the time what was the dynamic behind this. But the next big breakthrough, there were again incremental improvements over several years, but the next big breakthrough came in, 16, 17, when we received these teachings on the primal self. And that's when I started realizing that I had come to Earth, just as Maitreya described, with a particular intention. I wanted to achieve a certain result. And that was, I wanted to help people overcome their suffering. But I had realized after I came to Earth that I couldn't help people if they wouldn't listen to me. So I had sort of created these selves that believed that the only way I could fulfill my reason for coming to Earth was if I got people to listen to me. And they wouldn't listen to me if they saw that I had made a really bad mistake, or if they thought I wasn't a good person. And I also started realizing that I had these selves that felt that this is a very difficult, very low planet. I didn't choose to come here because I wanted to experience something on Earth, because I wanted to do something for my personal enjoyment. I was only here to help improve the situation on the planet. That's why I'd come, is what I felt. And so, in other words, if I couldn't achieve what I had come here for, the whole thing had been one big failure. What was the point in even coming here, going through all of this suffering, if I couldn't achieve anything worthwhile? And so this created this entire dynamic where I felt I couldn't be really wrong. And it was only when I started seeing the primal self and overcoming this primal self, and I came to that point, as I described before, I felt that complete release, and I sensed I don't have to do anything on Earth. That's when I started feeling that I had really broken through the cause of the tension. Because I had this tension, and I probably had it for 2 million years, of feeling that I had to do something on Earth, but because what I had to do on Earth depended on other people's reactions, it seemed impossible to accomplish what I was here for. And that's why there was always this specter in the background that I could completely fail to accomplish what I was here to do. And if I did that, my whole journey on Earth had been a failure. I should never have come here, was what these cells were projecting, or maybe the fallen beings were projecting at me. And when I unrooted that first element, or that first primal self, that was when it started really lifting. Before that, there had been a certain incremental improvement. I wasn't as tense in 2009 as I was in 1999 or in 1989. But I still had this deep inner tension. And I guess what I wanted to say with all of this is that it is actually possible to overcome this tension. And that overcoming this tension is, as I see it now at least, the major benefit of walking the spiritual path. The major benefit. It makes everything you have to do worthwhile. I can look back at my path and all the things I've gone to, and I can see there was an experience I needed. There was an experience that helped me resolve something. I needed to do this because that helped me see this, and so forth and so on. So I don't have to look back with regrets and evaluate, was this right? Was it wrong? Was it a mistake? Did I fail my test? I needed the experiences I needed in order to make the maximum progress in this, what is potentially my last embodiment on Earth. And I remember many years ago, actually before I was going to go to the United States, I met with a Danish priest from the Danish State Church, Lutheran State Church. And I mentioned, she was trying to basically talk us out of going to America and leaving our lives in Denmark, I think. And I mentioned this situation where Jesus calls his disciples, and she says they believe this, oh no, he didn't just call them and they immediately walked away from everything. No, they had at least a year, wherever she got that from, to get their affairs in order so they were ready to follow him. But I knew that that wasn't the case. I knew that what she was saying was not necessarily wrong for people who are not in their last lifetime. You have more time. You don't have to leave everything else behind. But if you are in your last lifetime, if you know it's part of your divine plan to qualify for your ascension in this lifetime, you don't have a lot of time to dilly-dally. You just have to get on with having the experiences you need to have in order to see certain things in yourself and overcome those selves. And you can't stay too long in one place. You can't stay longer than you need to. You simply need to move on, whatever other people think about it. However angry they get for you moving on and they feel you're leaving them behind and that's wrong and for this and that and the next reason. But if this is your last embodiment, You need to do what you need to do. You need to experience what you need to experience. And it's not that any of what you did is wrong. It's obsolete to think in those terms. It was part of your path. It was something you needed to do to come to a certain insight, to come to a certain level of resolution, and to rise to a certain level of the path. Today, I look back at my life and I say, well, it was all just part of the path. It was all experiences I need to have. It's meaningless to say, was this wrong or was this right? So what I've also learned as part of this process is not to be attached to my outer beliefs and viewpoints. It was many, many years ago that I actually realized that I had the same need for security that we all have. I had the need to feel that there were certain things I knew that were genuine, that were valid, especially after I found the Standard Master teachings. I found, well, at least what the masters are telling us is something I can trust, is something I can believe in. But it's not that what the masters are telling us are wrong, but what I came to realize is that my ability to grasp the master's teachings was a product of my current level of consciousness. And naturally, I could see that I understood more at that point than I did 10 years earlier. And I assumed that if I kept walking the path, I would understand more in 10 years than I do now. So it was meaningless to say that there is anything that I know and believe today that is the ultimate understanding. Because anything that I see today could potentially be not necessarily replaced, but it could be expanded by a greater understanding. And even to this day, now I've been a messenger for 18 years. I've taken, over 800 dictations, lots of questions and answers. I have a much greater understanding of the spiritual path than I had even in the Summit Lighthouse, where I had a much greater understanding than I had in TM. But still, I maintain this. There is nothing that I know or think I know or believe today that couldn't be expanded, that couldn't be replaced by a greater understanding, that couldn't be put in a different context. So what meaning does it give to say that I could make a mistake by seeing through an illusion and giving it up? Why does the fact that I have a limited understanding today, why is that a mistake? It's a product of my level of consciousness. I'm not deliberately believing in an illusion. If I believe in an illusion, it's because I haven't seen it. It's an illusion because I can't see it with my level of consciousness. So how could it be a mistake to say I believed in that illusion? I have to accept that I'm at a certain level of consciousness right now, and I see what I see. I'm constantly striving to rise higher, and when I move a step higher on the path, I may see something I can't see now. I may see that what I believe now is an illusion. But why is that a mistake? Well, it is a mistake if I believe that the belief I have not now is the ultimate truth and therefore it should never be questioned. That's a mistake because that will hold me back on the path. So it's like there came a point, and it was actually even before the primal self, where I started realizing that seeing through my illusions is an ongoing process. It will never end. There was a certain projection against me that because I'm a messenger for the Ascended Masters, I should have a certain ultimate level of understanding. In the Summit Lighthouse, it was very much projected that Elizabeth Care Prophet, she had a higher level of consciousness, the Christ consciousness, and she knew and saw everything. And I don't believe that's true. She had a high level of consciousness, it's not that, but it was still not the ultimate level. And there was none of what she believed or saw that was the ultimate understanding, because as the masters have said, they can't give it to us on a planet like this. So what I came to realize is that the whole belief that I should be perfect, that I should be not make a mistake, that I should have the highest understanding was actually a resistance. It created a resistance to my growth. And I realized that it didn't really make any sense that I'm a messenger for the Ascended Masters, but I'm resisting growing on the path. I'm resisting seeing through some illusions and coming to a higher understanding. So I can see when I look back, and this is part of what the Masters have been talking about here, that we have these separate selves, and they are resisting what the Masters are trying to do. They are resisting getting the insights and the revelations and making the changes that the Masters are seeking to help us make. So it's almost like there's this push-pull on the path. You know, you have this old joke in Denmark that there was a man who was out walking at night, and it was icy. It was so slippery that every time he took one step forward, he would slide 2 steps backwards. And of course, that's an impossible situation, right? But that's in a sense what we're in on the path. The Masters are pulling us to take a step forward, but then our separate selves and egos are pulling us to go backwards, maybe 1 or 2 steps. So it's always this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And that's part of the tension. And I had this for the first many years on the path. But there came that point, I don't even remember really when, but years ago, where I just suddenly saw it, and I just decided, I actually said to the Masters, I'm not resisting you. You can show me anything you want to show me. I'm not trying to hide from you. I don't want you to hold back. Just show me what I need to see in order to move on. And it's not that the Masters have then, as you imagine, people imagined in the summit, stepped forward and exposed all of my ego and pounded me down for having this or that belief. They have, of course, worked with me, as they always do. But the primary effect of making this decision was it relieved another level of tension, because I no longer had the resistance. And that made it so much easier to walk the path. So what I'm trying to say here is that I have experienced in myself that there comes a point where you kind of turn a corner on the path. And now you don't have the resistance, you don't have the tension. And you are at peace with walking the path. It doesn't mean you feel you reach some ultimate level. You are at peace being on the path and continuing to walk the path and take 1 step at a time. And it's just so much more peaceful and enjoyable to reach that level, that I really encourage you to ponder this, to consider it, and to use the tools the Masters have given us, because it is the separate selves that creates this tension and this resistance. And I know that for me, it was a process to come to the point where I could make that decision. So I'm not saying that you can just listen to this and then you can decide, oh, I'm going to make that decision now. And then you make the decision with your outer mind. When I'm talking about a decision, I'm not talking about making a decision with the outer mind. I'm talking about resolving something in your psychology so that the decision comes spontaneously. It's not really a decision, it's more of a realization. And it's a realization that, oh, this is the way it is. I don't need to resist. I don't need to feel I'm wrong. I don't need to evaluate myself based on right and wrong. And these are realizations, it's resolution. So I would encourage you to maybe use this as an inspiration and then see what tools can I use that the Masters have given us to maybe move closer to the point where I can feel that spontaneous decision, feel that release. I can also let go of the tension and feel at peace with being on earth, being who I am, being at the present level of the path. You don't have to be perfect. It's the ego that wants some ultimate state. And once you let go of that, you are realizing, well, I don't need to claim I have reached the highest levels of Christ consciousness. I'm on the path. I'm still walking the path. I don't even worry about anymore where I'm at on the path. There was a point where I was very concerned about where am I at on the path? Am I making enough progress? And there came a point where it just faded away. So I'm not evaluating, am I in a higher level of consciousness than other people? Am I at a certain level of the 144 levels? It doesn't matter anymore, because I know that I will continue to take that one step at a time, go higher and higher. And that's what the path is all about. And that's the way it'll be for the rest of the time I'm in embodiment, until I reach that 144th level and I can take that final step. And so that was really what I wanted to share with you. I know I've gone a little bit over time here, but I'm grateful that you allowed me to share this. And I thank you for being with us today, and look forward to being with you again tomorrow.